We're going to get started, I think. So the host tonight is Melinda Jones, who is the current president of NCJWA National. I'm going to hand over to her.
Thank you very much, Bree. Well, welcome. We've got 147 people in the room so far, and we have 300 people who registered for tonight's event. So this is very exciting. My name is Melinda Jones. I'm the National President of National Council of Jewish Women Australia. And this is the second of our sessions in the lead up to the Yomim Noraim, to the Rosh Hashanah, to the New Year. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. The Bonorong people of the Kulin Nation are the people on whose land I'm sitting. But we're meeting from all around Australia, so we're on the land of many Indigenous people. Someone's computer is not on mute. Please mute your computer because there's a radio in the background. Thank you very much. Okay, please watch it in case you unmute, and this is going to be quite an easy thing to happen. So, having acknowledged the traditional owners of the land, I then want to introduce our speakers. Our topic is New Ways for New Days, and the people who are going to talk about new ways are Rabbanit Ellyse Borghi. Ellyse, say hi.
Hi, everybody.
And Rabbanit Judith Levitan. Judith, say hi.
Hi.
The new days that we're talking about are really, there's more than one lot of new days. First of all, we're all living a very different and new sort of life, being in lockdown in Melbourne where I am. But even if you're not in lockdown in Melbourne, COVID has created a new sort of environment for us all. Secondly, we are, of course, leading up to the Jewish New Year, to Rosh Hashanah. And every time we have a new year, we have a rebirth. This is an opportunity for us to take a breath, dive deep into our own lives, examine what's gone on, what's happened in the past, and see how we're going to be reborn in a different sort of person to the one we were during this existing year. And the third way that's relevant tonight of new sorts of days is that the world of Jewish practice for women is entering a new phase. So for something like 100 years, and I'm going to get told off by all the people who say I should have checked my dates more carefully, there have been women operating as rabbis in communities around the world. And many of those women, many women who wanted to have more Jewish learning, moved from the Orthodox world to the world of Reform, or to Conservative, or to Renewal, or to one of the other branches, because there was no place for Jewish women as rabbis within Orthodox Judaism. Tonight we have with us two women who have actually really become trailblazers in the new world of Orthodox Judaism, because they've become rabbis not by moving and reforming Judaism and not by saying we can find an alternative way of being Jewish, but right within the conservative heart of Judaism, in the traditional process of Judaism, they have said, we are going to be rabbis, we are going, as women, going to take on this role. So my first question to each of you is, what gave you this mad idea of becoming rabbis? What a strange, I mean, what sort of job is that for a nice Jewish girl?
Ellyse, you want to kick off?
No, go for it, Judy.
Okay. I guess for me, I've always struggled. I've had, like, all my life this struggle between orthodoxy and feminism. And how that sort of plays out. So how you can sort of sit, or, you know, as an Orthodox woman, you sit within a world where Hashem is there all the time. You're bound by mitzvot, by duty, by commitment, by obligation. And being a feminist, you're living in feminism is a secular construct. So by definition, there's no God. And it's all about, you know, equality, power, freedom. how do you mix, how do these two things sort of sit together? How do you live in a world where there's no God and there is God at the sort of same time? And so I guess that was always the struggle for me. And through the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, through JWA, I was able to, I guess, explore this. And it was really at one of the JWA conferences that I, you know, it's like a distant dream. I went to New York, I went overseas. And it was really there that twice in my life, I guess, once when I first was introduced to Orthodox feminism, and then again when I was introduced to really the possibility of becoming an Orthodox rabbi, that this idea came up. So it was really through that Orthodox feminist lens that the idea was put in my head to go down that path.
Thank you. Ellyse?
You know, I feel like I was waiting for this opportunity since I was a teenager. I think in the Orthodox world, it's really common when you finish high school to go and pursue a year of study in yeshiva or in seminary. And for the boys who were really serious about learning, that was the time when they really started on that track towards the Rabbanit, but towards becoming rabbis. And I really think that as a 17 and 18-year-old, that was when at that stage, I already felt like that's what I would love to do, and that it just was not there. So I had to wait, and I just did other things in the meantime. And once the opportunity arose, I really jumped at it. I've been waiting patiently for this time to come.
So on the path, can you just give us just some really basic background about your life stories, you know, sort of just a plot of what you did, you know, what were the key sort of features in your life leading there, and the sorts of degrees, and, you know, tell us about your families and about, you know, how this all fits in with life.
Well, I was raised in a traditional Orthodox home in Sydney. We were two girls, and we were always encouraged to have our own opinions and to think for ourselves, and also books and Jewish knowledge was really around and abounding in the house. And I guess that sparked my curiosity. And I tell this story, I remember I would have been a teenager, and there was like a Shabbos afternoon Gemara shiur that was going on, and I went with my father. I was like this one teenage girl with all these sort of like middle-aged to older men sitting there. But you know, that was it was sort of like no one blinked an eye, and you know, my dad never blinked. He just sort of took me along on that journey. So I think that probably laid the foundation. I went to a Jewish day school. I did like Ellyse, a gap year in Israel through B'nai Akiva. Unlike Ellyse, I guess, I never had, it's interesting because I'm a bit older. So like for me, when I was 18, there was no Havamina. There was no sort of even idea of that as being really a possibility, but I enjoyed studying. And so I went back to yeshiva. And I guess then I kept studying on and off, like in my own time with my husband. So that kind of, I guess, sets the scene for my Jewish identity, if you like, along with the feminism, the Orthodox feminism.
And can I just ask a follow-up question before we go to Ellyse? You said you were always a feminist, so where did your feminist journey start? So we sort of have a sense of this Jewish journey, but what about the feminist journey?
Yeah, probably my feminist consciousness was awoken. There was always something stirring within me, but it probably was formally brought about through university, I guess through studying law and studying social work. And sort of looking at, like, I had those sort of feminist yearnings or leanings, but then always sort of looking at, well, how does that relate and how does that work within Judaism? How can I reconcile it within Judaism?
Okay, Ellyse, over to you. So a bit about your potted background.
Sure. So I come from Melbourne. I was raised in a modern Orthodox family and grew up within the modern Orthodox community in Melbourne. So I went to Yavna College and graduated from there. I spent a year in seminary, the same seminary as Judy, in Jerusalem. And then I started an arts law degree, which my major was in Jewish civilization. My minor was in gender studies. So you might have seen this one coming. And I used almost all my opportunities in university breaks, and even once I started work as a lawyer, using my annual leave to go back to yeshiva and keep learning. I was really keen. So that's what I did. And on one of those occasions when I was learning in Israel during my annual leave, one of my friends, who was also a recently ordained woman from Maharat, told me that there was a new yeshiva being opened in Israel. And apart from being innovative that they were giving ordination to women, they were teaching men and women together. So it was a rabbi who'd been teaching rabbinical students for about 20 years, and he'd always only taught men, and now he was opening up the class to women as well.
Fantastic. Now, about 15 years ago, Ellyse, it might have not been 15 years ago, it might have only been 10 years ago, you wrote an article for National Council of Jewish Women's Bulletin about, I'm not sure exactly why what it was that we were exploring initially in the article, but you told a story there that actually shows that your feminism and your Jewish awakening were actually related from very early in your life. Do you want to share with everybody what happened to you and what you recounted in that article?
Yeah, it was a very long time ago, so long ago that I was not even a teenager yet, where the year that I was in year 7, so you're 12 years old. So that year was the year that Yavna College, they start learning Gemara in that year, the Talmud, which is really foundational to rabbinic studies and to higher Jewish learning. And so that was the year that I was first introduced to learning Talmud and Gemara. And unlike perhaps some of my peers, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was the most interesting class of the week. And I mean, we were learning about how to build a sukkah, how to tie knots on Shabbat, things that people otherwise perhaps might not find so gripping, but I was in heaven there. And so the first half of the year I was learning Gemara, and then the boys would go on to learn Gemara the entire year, but because it was, we were 12 that year, the girls would learn Gemara for the first half of the year, and the second half of the year we had bat mitzvah class, which could sometimes be very meaningful, and other times involved a visit to learn about lighting Shabbat candles, or learning how to make challah, or very, like, if you imagine the way perhaps bat mitzvah classes used to be and bat mitzvah ceremonies used to be. So for me, these bat mitzvah classes were, I felt like the boys were getting ahead. They were, you know, they were progressing with their studies, and here I was making bread. And so I became a little bit fed up with it, and I convinced, I don't know how, the other girls in my class that, you know, that it wasn't fair that we were stuck making beeswax candles while the boys got to learn, even though I think most high school kids would probably be happy to do arts and crafts instead of being stuck with Aramaic, but somehow we became very indignant about this. And so we staged a sit-in. At the time that we were meant to be having bat mitzvah class, we went to the Gemara class and just sat in that room and said, we're not going to leave until we can learn. And the Gemara teacher was a bit confused. They went and got the other Gemara teacher. They went and got the principal. They tried to talk us down out of that room. And eventually we reached an agreement, which was that the curriculum was what it was that year, and that they weren't going to be changing the curriculum on the fly, but that from the following year, they would be, and that the girls would be able to take the Gemara class for the entire year. And so that's what I did. I kept learning from that time when I was 12. I kept learning Gemara, and it's been a great joy for me.
Wow. You know, when I hear that story and when I read that story, I thought, you know, because, you know, I taught law at university for many years, and I taught Judith back in the day. And my thoughts hearing that story was, I know what she's going to be when she grows up. She's going to be a lawyer. She's got social justice in her blood, right? She's going to go and fight the good fight, bring about the revolution. And funnily enough, the path to becoming an Orthodox rabbi does seem to include the study of law. And both of you are lawyers. Before I ask you about the relationship between secular law and Jewish law and the way it affects your experience and in your professional life from day to day, and perhaps in your rabbinic life from day to day, I just thought I would share a story with you about a very important Jewish activist in America. His name's Bella Abzug. Now, Bella, if you watch the television series called Mrs. America about the ERA, about the Equal Rights Amendment, she featured in that film. Now, she was a nice Jewish girl from an Orthodox Jewish family. And in the 1940s, she wanted to study to become a rabbi. But it wasn't possible for her to become a rabbi as in a good American Orthodox household. So she said, oh, well, if I can't become a rabbi, I'll do law. So she became a lawyer instead, and then became one of the earliest Congress women, one of the first women ever to be in Congress, and a very important activist for the feminist movement, but also as a Jewish activist, her Judaism was always important to her. So it does seem to me that we can find many cases of a close relationship between Jewish activism and the desire for Jewish learning and understanding Jewish law. So perhaps Ellyse will start with you this time, and you can tell us about your journey as a lawyer and how this is relevant to how the two relate.
Yeah, I think I do think that it's not an accident that I ended up in this profession. And I work in an area of social justice law that I'm really passionate about. And sometimes it can actually be a little bit embarrassing how much, to me, my work in the law really feels like an extension of my Jewish identity. In as much as I feel really compelled to try to spend my days contributing and using the skills that I have to just like assist where possible. And so I really do think that in going into the law and working in social justice, it's a bit, I don't know if I would call it social justice. I'm a legal aid lawyer. But I do feel like, I don't know if I would call it social justice. I'm a legal aid lawyer. But I do feel like, I do feel like my desire or my obligation from God to contribute to the world guided me in making those choices to become the type of lawyer that I am.
Judith?
It's interesting, Ellyse, that you say, you obviously you work at Legal Aid and I work at Legal Aid, and what you say there about it being a sort of extension of yourself. Yeah, I was talking to my colleagues at work and they were sort of asking me about how you sort of meld these two. And I think when I think about it, legal aid is all about, it's public legal assistance. It's about access to justice for people who wouldn't otherwise have access to the law or to legal services. And in a way, being a rabbi, I think we fulfill the same role. And I think that's how I see myself in my role, is providing an additional access point to the law and to Judaism. So it's also providing that access to the justice, that access to the legal system, and that access to knowledge. I think for me also, from a young age, I felt a need to contribute to the world. And I looked at, well, how best can one do that? And that's why, I've got the social work and the law there. I couldn't quite make up my mind how. But I think, when you have access to the law, you have that access to a degree to power and to the systems and to the people that sort of shape the society. And I think when I think about how I understand Judaism, it's interesting because from speaking to some of my colleagues and who studied with me, there are a number of women who were lawyers who then also who went on and who studied at Maharat, but there are also a number who weren't. But I always saw Judaism as a legal system, whereas I think, sometimes people might not necessarily see the religion as such, like maybe it is there as literature or as culture or as, poetry. But I really saw it as this system. And I guess that came from the legal sort of side. And I saw it as also a human enterprise that really, you've got the Torah, but then we are told, lo bashamayim here, it's not in heaven. And in fact, it's for us to manipulate and to shape. And that's the same thing with secular law. That's how law works. It's a human endeavor. So I think seeing Judaism that way, as a system, as a legal system, and as a place where if you want to make change, you've got to really know the law and be able to have a conversation about the law. Probably, I'd say that's how I sort of would relate the two together.
So one of the biggest problems that we see, a lot of people see with Orthodox Judaism, and certainly a very big issue in Orthodox Judaism, is the problem of agunot. And this has been a matter of concern for National Council of Jewish Women. We've been very concerned about the plight of women who are chained to their husbands because they cannot get a divorce in Jewish law. Now, that must sit very hard with you. I'm wondering how you respond to it and what do you think we can do with it? Do you think we can solve it within Orthodoxy, or do we have to somehow go outside Orthodoxy to get to a solution?
Melinda, this is something that I'm really passionate about. I am a member of the Unchain My Heart committee, and so we work with the Melbourne Beit Din, but we also work with cases internationally to try to resolve cases of agunot, and also to educate the community and engage with the community on this issue. And you know what? There's a lot of people within the agunot advocacy space who are very pragmatic. And if going to the secular courts is what's going to get the quickest result, then there's a lot of people who are very focused on trying to find solutions within secular law. As someone who's both, and I work in frequently. I work in family law, so I'm really familiar with those options that are available. But I think that, you know, as a rabbi, as an Orthodox rabbi, I have a lot of faith in halakha. And I really think that, and to me, you know, it's a divine system of law. It's not possible to have something so divine and that's imbued with the values of justice, that there couldn't be a solution within it. I think that the problems that we're facing within halakha are the problems of the limited creativity of human beings, and that the solutions really are there within halakha. And I think if halakha has created this system, it's also got solutions for it. And I'm a big advocate for the solutions that are available already. And I teach brides. And so I'm there before you get married, before you get into the situation, and I work with agunot who are already in that situation. So I really think I have a lot of faith within halakha, within Orthodox Judaism, that we're able to do it ourselves.
Judith.
Well, I think that there actually is precedent within halakha for a number of solutions. And to some extent, we are limited sociologically, like there are sociological limitations or political limitations that we have. But like Ellyse, I would say that the halakha is elastic enough to provide us with solutions. There's just got to be that sociological will to apply them to somebody.
Well, it's incredibly important having women in rabbinic positions to be able to solve some of these problems. You know, it was, I think, in 1983, but I could be wrong, that Blue Greenberg said about this problem: if there's a halachic will, there'll be a halachic way. So the question is, with women at the forefront of some of these halachic conversations, perhaps we can come to some sort of halachic solution. Mm. Now, I asked both of you when we were preparing for this conversation if you would share something about the new days that we're approaching in your own unique new way. And so perhaps, Judith, do you want to start and share with us some of your thoughts for the upcoming Hagim?
For Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
So I've got, I don't know if you, you'll share that document afterwards. Okay, all right. So I think that it's very hard for us now coming up to Rosh Hashanah, because partly Rosh Hashanah is really about the coronation of Hashem as king. And how do you celebrate a coronation? You celebrate it in a crowd. And we are really hardwired to celebrate and to find Hashem and connect with him in the crowd. There is a saying in Mishlei, in Proverbs, which is Barov Am Hadrat HaMelech, that the glory of the king is in the multitude. And that phrase is understood by our rabbis from the Midrash to mean that's Hashem. That, you know, the glory of Hashem is in the crowd. If you think about like our rock stars, when do they shine brightest? It's when they're performing to their arenas of tens of thousands of people. There's something about a crowd. And in halakha, we are hardwired to think that way too, about really the preference of a crowd. So there are many examples through the Gemara and then also through our halachic system of where there's a preference for a crowd for doing mitzvot. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah talks about, you know, when we're blowing the shofar, you should do it at Musaf, because that's when the majority of the people will be at shul. It's interesting that even in the Gemara, however many thousands of years, most people just came for Musaf, right? That idea of really being in the crowd, when, you know, the debate between Hillel and Shammai, do you say a bracha individually or together as a group? The preference is if someone says a bracha for the group. We're really hardwired for this crowd. in the prayer that we have and that we say on Rosh Hashanah, there's a prayer called Unatane Tokef. And there's one line in this prayer where it's talking about Hashem judging us. And it says the shofar will sound, and then there will be this kol dmama udaka. There'll be this really still small voice. And I think that that juxtaposition of the shofar, which really is like, that symbolizes the coronation of Hashem. That symbolizes Hashem in the crowd, right? Juxtaposed with this idea of this kol dmama daka, that we can also find Hashem alone and in that still small voice. We look at where that phrase kol dmama daka comes from. We see it in the story of Eliyahu. Eliyahu really was a failed prophet. He failed to communicate he got very angry and very zealous, but he really failed to communicate his message and really get to the heart of the Jewish people. And he sort of threw his hands up in the air, retreated to the desert, and went and sat in the cave. And we see there this sort of strange reference to Hashem saying it's not in the noise, it's not in the might of the noise and the rumble of the mountain, it's in this kol dmama daka. That's where you have that, you can find that connection to Hashem. So even if you're feeling alienated, which I think, you know, as a result of this pandemic, we have this sense of alienation. There is still that option to connect to Hashem through that kol dmama udaka. Similarly, if we look at the Haftorah that we read on Rosh Hashanah, it's a Haftorah about Hannah, about a woman who really was longing for children, and it was a struggle for her to actually get a child. And she goes and she pours her heart out to Hashem. And from her, we learn the model of prayer. And how does she pray? It's that kol dmama udaka. It says in the text that she mouthed the words, but no word comes out. So I think that we can see in that prayer of Unatane Tokef, that shofar gadol and the kol dmama udaka, that still silent voice. And what we have to do at this point for us, I guess, in human history, really across the world, is pivot, is sort of try and rearrange those neurons in our brains from being hardwired that we think Barov ha'am hadrat hamelach, that you can only find God in a crowd. And even though it is Hashem's coronation and we're blowing the shofar, the trailing note of that shofar is that kol dmama udaka. And that is what I think we can draw inspiration from and hold on to and connect to Hashem that way this year.
Thank you very much. That's quite heartening. If you're in Melbourne, one of the things that's happening is there are going to be people walking the streets blowing shofars at various places. So you might not be able to do anything else in terms of formal participation, but if you go for a walk during the time that Musaf would normally be on Sunday, you should possibly be able to at least hear the shofar this year. Ellyse.
Thanks, Melinda. You know, when you asked me about this, you asked, what do you bring? What's new that you bring to Rosh Hashanah and to Judaism? And, you know, I thought about it, and you know what? Everybody who's coming to Judaism, who's coming to Torah, but also every person coming every day is bringing something totally different. Each one of us is completely unique, and we have our own experiences, and we bring that to everything that we do. And I just think how much more enriched Judaism and Torah can be when we've got a wider range of people contributing with different experiences. And for me, this became really obvious when I was learning in yeshiva, and my rabbi, who was used to teaching men, and he'd been teaching men for decades, he taught us something from Kabbalah, and it was about Rosh Hashanah. And so I'll share it with you. And I can see, you know, there's a lot of women here tonight, and I think that for me, my experience of these texts was so different to his. so on Rosh Hashanah, we sing a piyut. We sing a particular prayer called Hayom Harat Olam. Often we start with Hayom, 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 Hayom. I want to continue. No one needs to suffer more than those few moments. But this piyut that we sing talks about Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the day that the world was created, which is in some ways true in Judaism, that Rosh Hashanah is obviously the birthday of the world, the creation of the world. But in the Jewish calendar, Nisan, the time of Pesach, is actually the first month of the year, and Rosh Hashanah falls in Tishrei on the 7th month of the year. So it's a common question of, well, when was the world created? And my rabbi was teaching that, well, the secret might be in this piyut, because it says Hayom Harat Olam. Harat, this word, is connected to herayon, pregnancy. And so the Kabbalah takes this little word and thinks about it, and they say, you know what? The world was conceived on Rosh Hashanah, and God gestated it and birthed the world at Pesach. And the Kabbalah really focuses in on this and really thinks about the symbolism of this. And they go right into thinking about how at the time of Pesach we have this is gonna perhaps maybe you'll never be able to do a Seder the same way again when you think about the blood on the doorposts and the splitting of the seas and the taking a nation out of another nation. It's the Kabbalah gets very graphic in terms of how Pesach is a birth and how Rosh Hashanah is a conception. It's the very beginning of the world, and then the world has to be gestated. And you know, I'm at the very beginning years of motherhood, and so the memories and the reality of what it's like to be pregnant and what it's like to give birth are very visceral for me. And so we could have had, you know, 700 years of rabbis talking about conception, gestation, birth, and never having experienced it. And for me, when I think about these concepts, I realize how hard it is to create something. And so when we think about God conceiving of the world, gestating the world, and birthing the world, for me, I think about how many miracles there are in conception, and how many miracles there are in being able to bring something from conception all the way into reality. And that's true for, you know, our work, and it's true for our ideas and our life and things that we build, and it's true for human beings when we give birth. And for me, that how many miracles that involves makes me think also every Rosh Hashanah about what I've brought into the world in this past year and what I'm going to bring into the world in the next year, and how much work it takes to do that, and how, just like with every birth, you know, there's no guarantee of a good outcome necessarily. There's a lot of sadness and a lot of loss in that world as well. And so it's quite a delicate relationship there. And so to me, I think that's the reason why the Kabbalah brought those concepts, was because that's the challenge for all of us, really every year, to accept the challenge of doing the hard work of creating and renewing, and accepting that we might not succeed and there might be losses along the way. But that, you know, just as God birthed the world, and there's so much love in that world of birth and the relationship between a parent and a child, I just think about the amount of love that we can also work to create, and that's the image that the Kabbalah wanted to inspire us with. And so I hope that everybody else here will also like do the hard work of creation.
Well, Ellyse, that's really, you're right. I'll never think about Pesach the same way. But I also think that both of you have really brought what I think you could very often think of as a woman's perspective on the subject of Rosh Hashanah and prayer, because it's about touching emotionally with the root of what this is all about. And when we do it through learning, it's a different sort of spirituality than when we do it through, for example, breathing. And these are all legitimate ways of coming to understand the world. But the modern Orthodox perspective, bringing women in, is going to, I think, add a lot of extra love and a lot of extra depth to Judaism, because, as you say, there are so many more of us here, women whose voices have previously not been part of the conversation. So I'm going to open the conversation now to all of you. And I've been asking, people have been typing questions into the chat. And I think, Bree, you're going to lead off with some questions.
Let me just unmute myself before I do anything else. There's been a number of questions in the chat, some quite interesting ones as well. If you just one second. One of the questions that has been asked is, what are your thoughts or feelings or desires as a rabbi who can't be counted towards a minyan or be a halachic witness? Do you see those as future milestones in this evolution, or is that not something that you see as relevant to your rabbinical journey at this point in time? And that was asked to both of you, so I don't know who'd like to answer first.
I think we've got slightly differing views on, I guess, on this.
Yeah. Look, I'll go first. I'm the radical, so I think that I think it's gonna come. I think just this past few weeks there was a really significant, really mainstream Orthodox rabbi in Israel, Rav Melamed, who's the author of many books of halacha and the head of a very relatively conservative yeshiva, who came out and he said, you know, there's really no reason why women couldn't be rabbinic judges, couldn't be dayanim or dayanot. And so I think about how many changes have occurred within the past 20 years, 30 years, 50 years of within Orthodoxy. And I'm sure that, you know, halacha is not static. It's going to keep going. Who knows where it'll go, but I think it will always move towards equality, because to me, you know, justice and equality are really divine values. And if we've got a divine system, that's the direction it's going.
It's interesting, Ellyse, what you were saying about Rav Melamed, because I think what he initially said, he said, oh, it's pashut, it's obvious, it's clear that women can be poskot, that women can answer, that have halachic authority to answer halachic questions. Now the question is about dayanut. So even in that statement, I think that there's that movement, and I think for me that's what it is. I feel we are moving at breakneck speed. We are moving very fast, and being a lawyer, I'm cautious. I guess I'm naturally cautious, and I'm also cautious, and I'm also sort of, I guess, sensitive to I guess to the controversy that surrounds ordination of women, if you like, and the pushback on feminism, and the concern that, are we going to destroy the joint? Like, you know, with the changes that are coming about, we've have this beautiful tradition for 2,000 years. what happens when you push these levers? And we know that law moves slowly. Case law precedent, it moves slowly, and it is sort of cautious. So I guess that's my knee-jerk reaction, is to have that sort of more cautious, to take that more cautious approach. But I do recognize, as you said, and you know, I'm the first one to say, as I said before, like halacha is about movement. That's what halacha means, right? Holech, to go. And really it is about, it is a human kind of enterprise. There is that idea of that dialectic between the rabbi, between the law and the and the people. So I just, I guess, you know, I'm happy to take it a bit slow and just see how things sort of move along.
So thank you, both of you. Another question that's been asked is, if either of you were, or another woman was interested in becoming a congregational rabbi, is there space for that in the Australian Jewish community at the moment? Is there a potential role for a female woman, a female Orthodox rabbi as a congregational rabbi in Orthodox Shul?
I mean, I guess theoretically, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, if you think about like what our role would be, I don't think even, you know, as an author, like I sit in the sort of mainstream Orthodoxy. I'm not looking to go up on the bima and read from the Torah in front of everybody or lead the services. But if you look at the congregational rabbi in Sydney anyway, they're not doing that, are they? They're not reading from the Torah or leading the tefillot. They're giving the drasha. They're visiting, you know, COVID restrictions aside, they're visiting the sick, they're doing pastoral care, they're giving shurim, they're teaching. So I guess theoretically, like from that perspective, there is room for that. And definitely there's precedent for that. In America, there are women who are leading congregations. I don't know, I don't speak for Ellyse, but I don't know if that's necessarily the direction that I am looking to go in. I think also, like, if you look at, and COVID kind of throws this up, the model for organizing Jewish lives and organizing Jewish community, and you look at synagogues, and you look at, you know, organized religion on a whole, that sort of membership model is sort of on the wane. And there's more of an entrepreneurial, I think, model that's on the rise. So, you know, when I studied at Maharat, and also now what I do in my sort of day job is really human-centered design and looking at that innovation and entrepreneurship. So I guess that's kind of where my focus will be, is how would we innovate and create community and work across congregations? Because I think also, like, and it's interesting because I think people are think the congregational rabbi is the pinnacle of, you know, of what you want to sort of aspire to achieve. But if you're working across congregations or across cities like we are now, there is so much more power to affect change and connection to people. So kind of my 2 cents there on that topic.
Yeah, Judy, I really agree with you in terms of the amazing range of work that rabbis can do that sometimes involves being a congregational rabbi and sometimes looks a little bit different. And I think that, to me, one of the aspects of what community rabbis sometimes do that gets forgotten about is that community rabbis sometimes are answering halachic questions. And I think that there is a lot of scope within both Melbourne and Sydney to have women available to answer halachic questions. I think apart from like mikvah and like family purity laws, I think there's a lot of times in which 50% of the shul population might feel more comfortable speaking to a woman. And I think that's certainly what I've seen coming back to Melbourne, that they're
that's
really,
experience too. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a significant appetite for both being able to ask halachic questions, but also to have pastoral counseling with a woman. And that's part of what a community rabbi does. And so I do think that over time there will be an appetite for those types of professional roles for women rabbis.
Thank you. I really, that's really fantastic. There's a number of other questions in there, in the thing, but another question that I'd quite like, well, I personally am interested in is, has there been any, have you any thoughts about when or whether you'd ever be invited to sit, you'd be ever be invited to sit on a Beth Din as a rabbi in Australia, on an Orthodox Beth Din? Have you been invited? Do you see that as being something that is on the cards in the next little while?
I think it'll take quite a while. I'm not expecting that one to occur really in my lifetime. In Israel, there is a woman who has been appointed to be like an associate at a Beit Din. So she does research and helps write judgments. And so, you know, I could see a Beit Din in Australia having space for a woman as an associate and perhaps doing research and helping write judgments. I think, to be realistic, I don't think that's likely to include a woman in the Beit Din imminently.
And having said that, though, like, I think there is, and I think it's probably been your experience and my experience as well, that to work with the rabbis, there is a lot of scope to work with the rabbis. And certainly in Sydney, there, you know, it's my smicha has been very positively received, but both by the community and by rabbis. And so I think there is a lot of scope to work with the rabbis and with the rabbis on the Beit Din as well.
So for complete,
I wanted to come in now to ask a question that maybe many people have been wondering about. The question that is not really a fair question to ask you at all, but given that last week the court in Israel held that Malka Leifer was competent to stand trial to be extradited to Australia, people of course are concerned about the victims of abuse and have been standing, and NCJWA has been very keen to stand by the victims of abuse. But there's been a question that was asked, that I was asked to pose to you about, how do you think we as Orthodox women can live with the idea of an Orthodox woman being a predator, a sexual predator and abuser? What does that do to you as Orthodox women? And even the question was asked, how can you stay being Orthodox when you know there are people who are Orthodox who are abusers? But of course I could say, how can you stay being human when there are people who are human who are revolting? But nonetheless, there is a question that is often asked, that if you're an Orthodox person, you should be held accountable to higher standards than somebody who's not an Orthodox person. If you're an Orthodox rabbi, what is your response to this horrible story and the situation where we've got women who are victims and someone who is Orthodox who is an offender? Presumed, I mean, she hasn't been found guilty by a court of law at this point of time, which we must add, but just assuming for the sake of the argument that she is guilty of an offence, how do we live with Orthodox Jews who are criminals?
I guess I've done a lot of work around domestic violence, and it's a similar sort of dynamic there where it's an abuse of power. And I think also the dynamic in the community of responding to the existence of child abuse or of domestic violence in the community is a bit of a journey. And I think the journey starts sometimes with NIMBY, not in my backyard. This is not something that happened. Like when I first started researching and working in this area, that was kind of the response was, oh, this can't happen in the Jewish community. And I think that response is sort of like, well, if they're Orthodox, then well, it shouldn't happen. It obviously, it's against halacha very clearly, and it's against the law. But, you know, I say domestic violence is the great equalizer. It cuts across race, it cuts across class, it cuts across culture, it cuts across religion. Because what it is it's about an abuse of power. It's a power dynamic. And there's this there's an imbalance of power. That's the same thing with child abuse. And so if you cut to what the real root is of the problem, it's not about the religion or about the sort of trappings of whether or not the person is poor or rich, or if they're, you know, whatever the culture. It sits at the root of that sits that imbalance of power. And until we fix that imbalance of power, both in domestic violence, in child abuse, it's going to be there across all aspects of society. And yeah, go Ellyse.
And you know what, Judy, I think that part of the journey that we've been on is about, so in terms of balancing power and how do you access power, one of the real ways you access power is through education. And so you and I have been the beneficiaries of enormous education opportunities. But, you know, across the Orthodox world, it's certainly my hope that the more access to education that women have, the more access women will also have to power. And that's power within their own homes and power within their communities.
Karen Brannick has written in the comment, Karen, I hope you don't mind me naming you, but she's made a very appropriate and profound point, which is, why is it only Orthodox Jews who should be disturbed by a Malka Leifer? Perhaps it's time to think of all of us Jews with different practices, but all Jews, rather than putting us into categories with assumptions that may not be correct. I think that's actually a very important point. And in fact, when the question was raised, or when I was discussing this as a question, in one level, I'd say it's an illegitimate question to ask you why it is that this Orthodox person, you know, why should you feel any different because the person's Orthodox, because you're Orthodox, or whatever, because we are all responsible for each other. And we are all responsible for trying to address injustice where we see it. And it's absolutely correct that we as an organisation, National Council of Jewish Women, are working hard to show that we have respect for everybody's practice, whichever way you practice Judaism, or even if you don't practice Judaism. If you're a Jewish woman, your opinion and your sense of values are incredibly important to us. And you don't have to categorize yourself anyway, and we don't have to categorize anyone in any way in order for that person to be counted and included amongst us. And so I think that that was a worthy comment. But tonight, of course, our question is about, in the context of Orthodox Judaism, is there anything particular to say? And I think, Judith, your answer is also very significant, that if we understand power, we can come to our source of understanding in many different ways. But as long as we come to that understanding, we'll begin to be able to address the problem.
Yeah, and I think the issue is, if you say, oh, well, she's Orthodox, so it happens in the Orthodox communities, then what you're doing is that NIMBY, that's the NIMBY dynamic. It happens there, it doesn't happen here. And it allows us to then not look within ourselves, within our communities, within our homes. If we think about this, you know, the stats on domestic violence, I know the stats on domestic violence, not necessarily child sexual assault, but, you know, 1 in 4 women at some point in their life will experience some form of control or violence. So that means of all the women that are sitting here, 1/4 of them will. So that, you know, when you think of it like that, it's our issue, it's our problem, it's with us. And saying, oh, it happened in an Orthodox context, there is a danger that then you don't sort of say, well, but what can, you know, it happens here in my community and in, you know, in homes that I visit and that I go to as well. And I think that that's the important lesson to take out of this, is that it happens everywhere, and we are responsible for, you know, addressing that power imbalance.
But tonight, of course, we have been addressing a new world. Domestic violence has existed as long as people have been in relationships, unfortunately. Different societies have come to different ways of solving or not solving that problem. But Judaism, of course, is also very ancient, but not quite as ancient as humanity. And yet within Judaism, we have movement, we have halakha, as Judith said, we have movement, we have change. And it's been very exciting for us to talk about the sort of change that we can see by having in Australia, here in this far-flung part of the world, we have two such amazing women as Rabbanit Ellyse and Rabbanit Judith. And before I close the formal session, I'd like to ask each of you if there is something that I should have asked you, I should have thought to ask you, that you'd like to share with us. Ellyse.
You know, my grandmother is a very God-fearing woman. She's very pious, and I have a lot of respect for her. And, you know, when I started studying, I couldn't tell her. I could tell my dad, I could tell other rabbis in the community, but I couldn't tell my grandmother. And, you know, even until almost the very end, I actually never told her. I had my dad tell her, oh, you know, why is Ellyse going to Israel? Why is Ellyse moving her husband and her child and everyone over to Israel? What is she going to study? And so I had my dad tell her, and, you know, she called me up afterwards and she said, she didn't say, you know, I'm proud of you, I support you, but she said, you know, I was wondering, do you need any books before you go to Israel? I'd like to take you to Gold's and I can buy you some books. And, you know, to me, my grandmother, who lives in a, you know, a very conservative part of Melbourne, to me, that like meant the world, that she was, you know, willing to support me in my studies in that way.
Well, I hope that we've been supportive of you, because we are all great fans. You can see what a crowd of people we are here, all supporting you in your fantastic work, along with your grandmother. Thank you very much, Ellyse.
Okay.
And now, Judith.
You know, it's interesting, Ellyse, what you said. I had the same experience in terms of like not telling people when I first started studying. I think for me also, like it was a mind flip to actually think, I'm studying to be a rabbi, I'm studying for smicha. Like I couldn't even like almost tell myself. There was this like, and I also didn't tell my children. It took a while, and then I sort of started like letting everybody else know. So I had a similar sort of experience there. But I think the one experience I'd like to leave people with was the experience of how I sort of came to decide that I'm going to go on this path. Because, you know, it wasn't necessary, it was a curveball that sort of was thrown at me in a way. I kind of had let go. I kind of let go in a way of what could have been. And when I went to that Jaffa conference in 2017, we were sitting in this plenary of 2,000 women, and Blue Greenberg, it was her 80th birthday. And so they had like an honorarium for her, and she spoke. And she spoke about how, you know, it was her dream. And in 1983, when she wrote her book on women and Judaism, it was her dream, but that, you know, it wasn't a dream she ever thought she would see in her lifetime. And then following her was a very eloquent woman who spoke, who was a a community rabbi, and she really put out this call to arms. And then they asked then the audience, well, you know, how many women out here are now studying for smicha? And there were like 20 or so women that stood up. And then there was this thunderous applause. And that image, that moment really, for me, it reminded me of this story in the Gemara where there's this very virulent argument that goes on between the rabbis. It's this famous story of the oven of Achnai, and it's this argument between the rabbis about whether or not this oven is appropriate to use. And basically what happens is they're having this argument, and basically the one rabbi is sort of proving through the supernatural that his position is right. And the other rabbi says, no, but lo bashamayim, the Torah isn't in heaven. They're having this real argument. And then the Gemara sort of steps back, and then it says, Rabbi Natan was walking and he met Eliyahu Hanavi, and he asked Eliyahu Hanavi, what was Hashem doing when these rabbis were arguing like this? And Eliyahu says, Hashem was sitting back and he was laughing and he was saying, Nitzchuni banai nitzchuni, my sons, you have conquered me. And I think as a mother of teenage sons who are now growing taller than me by the day and who are, you know, starting out their journeys in the world, and my daughter who's about to have a bat mitzvah in a world where she can now, it's de rigueur that she can read from the Torah, and, you know, she's got a mom, the rabbi at the bat mitzvah is a woman, like that we have that situation, and that we had that situation at Jaffa where these women stood up. I really think, you know, what's Hashem doing now? I think Hashem is sitting back and laughing and saying, Nitzchuni bnotai nitzchuni. You have won, my daughters, you have won. And it's over to you now. And really it was at that moment that I thought, right, it's over to me. I'm going to take this on. So, and I think to everybody out there, over to you, really. Lean into Judaism, get involved. It's there for the taking.
Amen.
Thank you so much. I'm into both of you. Okay, this is the end of the formal proceedings for this evening. So perhaps everybody can share a Zoom clap with me, which we won't put off the mute. This has been a wonderful evening. And thank you both, and I think that everybody will be inspired by your stories and by the wisdom that you've shared with us tonight. This is the second of the webinars that we've organised for this period of Elul. We have next week a very different sort of activity, which is a baking of a honey cake. Now, if you don't have anyone to share your honey cake with, please join us anyway and bake one. And if you don't have anyone to give it to, knock on your neighbour's door. Share some of the Rosh Hashanah spirit with people who might be alone. So bake a honey cake, even if the only thing you do to celebrate Rosh Hashanah is bake that honey cake. There are lots of opportunities and lots of things to do this year. There are many, many opportunities of learning before Rosh Hashanah, further opportunities. Please be in contact if you'd like any information about things that are going on around the place, but just keep an eye on our Facebook group. If you haven't joined the Facebook group, please do. The information about the baking is it in the chat? Has it been put into the chat? It's in the chat. So please look at the chat and you'll get the information about how to join us for that next week. And you can also go to National Council of Jewish Women Australia National's homepage to get that. Also, don't forget that we've been writing this month stories called Elul Stories, where we've been hearing from women leaders about their experience and stories that they can share with us during COVID to give us some sense of warmth and well-being as we move towards Rosh Hashanah. And today, Rabbanit Judith's piece was shared with us, so that's available as well. So please stay online if you'd like to for a short conversation for people who are going to stay and have a bit of a hangout chat if you'd like to for a little bit longer, but this is the end of the formal proceedings. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Thank you, Melinda.